Hi there, I'm Jesse Bergman, and I'm the lead designer for Battle for Sularia and president of Punch Entertainment, and I'm super excited to welcome you to our Kickstarter campaign and introduce a little bit about us and what Punch It is. I'd started designing Battle for Sularia back in 2011, and I brought my good friend and now partner and co-founder John Kimmel in to help assist with the development of the game. So Battle for Sularia started originally and was released to Kickstarter in June of 2015. We successfully funded, and in that time we funded the Jotun and the Scythian, which you'll find in the Battle Begins box. We then ran an additional campaign in April of 2016 for Blood, Profit, and Glory, which is our expansion for the Jotun and Scythian, as well as adding some powerful new mercenaries to the fray. Now we're coming back to Kickstarter again, this time for the Praetorian faction. This is a standalone expansion, and we'll explain a little bit more about how that works and what pledge is right for you a little later in this video. But for now, I'd like to introduce you to my co-founder and partner, John Kimmel.
Hi everyone, I'm John Kimmel. I'm the other half of Punch Entertainment. As Jesse mentioned, I helped with as a co-founder, but also as a co-developer for the game. And I'm here to talk to you about a few things for our Kickstarter today.
Well, Battle for Sularia, first and foremost, is budget-friendly. What that means to you as a potential backer is that there is no random card packs to be found here. That means that every card that we release, it comes out in complete playsets of 4 copies found inside each box. So as a player of Battle for Sularia, you can expect that you'll have the same cards as your opponent right across the table from you every single game. This really does firmly put the control and your ability to win games directly on your skill level in the game, as well as your ability to build the best decks versus having some sort of budget that you have to operate in and playing against players with a larger budget to work with. Sularia is a very strategic game, and because of that, when players become very familiar with the mechanics of the game, you can expect your games to last around an average of about 20 minutes. But for your first few games, I would expect you to have gameplay around the 30 to 55 minute range, depending on how quickly you and your friends pick up the game and understand some of the core mechanisms as well as the cards that exist inside of the pool of cards available. Sularia also features a uniquely balanced deck construction system that's derived from miniatures list building. We call this the 60-90 system, and while I won't go into much detail here, you can expect to learn a little bit more about that in this video and what makes Sularia unique and different from other strategy card games on the market today. Battle for Sularia also features many multiple versions of ways to play the game. From the standard head-to-head 1 versus 1 gameplay to the faction war gameplay, which is 2 versus 2, to the 4 versus 4 or 8 versus 8. However many people you have that have decks can certainly play this game in various different ways, and some of our users have had a ton of fun coming up with variants and new ways to play Battle for Sularia. You can also expect to be able to draft Battle for Sularia through what's traditionally called a cube draft method. And boy, is it a fun way to play once you're familiar with the game. Battle for Sularia is supported by a highly established lore written by Matt Oakes. It is also richly illustrated by many different artists from around the globe, as well as our very own John Kimmel. What you'll find in this is what we think is a product that is as high a standard as what you'd find in any other game manufacturer on the market today, but we're doing it with just 3 guys. Battle for Sularia also features tournament play, because what strategy card game is complete without some competitive ways to test your mettle, if you will? And so with that in mind, we've featured many local game store tournaments here in our local area, as well as helping coordinate with users around the country to set up and establish their own tournaments in their own local friendly game stores. And on top of that, we're also now supporting Battle for Sularia through the Tabletop Simulator mod, and through that we're offering monthly tournaments online. So even if you have a demographic issue where you're not able to find a local store that is setting up tournaments, you can still play with very established Sularia players once a month through the Tabletop Simulator. So we think you'll find that Battle for Sularia is a very unique game, and one that offers something different in the marketplace than others.
Man, there's a variety of different things, but the things that we believe are the most different is our deck construction. So if you're familiar with tabletop war games, our cards all have a point cost on the card from 1 to 4. So the more common cards cost 1 or 2, the more power or rare cards, if you will, are 3 or 4. And that was our way of addressing an issue that we fundamentally have with a lot of other card games on the market. And that's kind of like power level, power creep. We believe we've balanced the game a little bit more successfully by having a system like this in place. So if you've played a lot of card games, typically you start looking for these power cards and you dismiss some of the more common cards. In our system, we've put value across all the cards, because if you have a 3 or 4 point card, the other component to all of this is a deck cannot exceed 90 points. So if you have a 3-point card or a 4-point card, clearly if you have 60 cards or more in your deck, you're going to exceed that 90 points rather quickly. So you start considering those 1 and 2s, which again, historically, you would not consider some of those lower powered cards in other card games. So that's really probably one of the major differences, and not just what we think, but a lot of the feedback. As Jesse mentioned, we've been working on this game since 2011. It came to Kickstarter originally in 2015. So in the course of that time period, we've gotten a lot of feedback, and the deck construction is one of the more challenging and fun and unique things that we have with our game system that we're really happy with the result of so far. Another thing that makes our game unique is our resource system. It's not just one resource, but it's actually 2. So with 2 resources, you kind of level out that curve, if you will, of sometimes you're flooded with resources, or other times you're starved for resources. With this 2 resource system, you're able to do something every turn. So we call it influence and Sularium. So with influence, every turn you can put any card in your hand face down on the playing field, or what we call the battlefield. So as you build your influence, it allows you to play cards which are your sight cards. Sight cards, in turn, generate our second resource. And there's other cards, too. As you get familiar with the game, there's other cards that generate the second resource, but that's called Sularium. And Sularium allows you to play cards as well. Those other cards are your combatant cards that you use to play with your Sularium. Over time, you might see other cards that require Sularium, but typically it's your combatants. So that's what's another unique element. With this 2 resource system, you're always able to do something every turn and not feel like you're just stuck. So that's, as a veteran card player, we appreciated that, and then that's been kind of the general feedback that we've gotten from the community, is that you always feel like you get to do something with our game as you're playing. You have your influence, you have your Sularium. If you can't play a combatant, at least you maybe got to play a sight. Maybe you didn't get a chance to play a sight, but you already have some Sularium in play, so you can play your combatants. So there's a lot of things that you can still do and not feel like you're stuck, in other words. So as I mentioned, the deck construction is definitely unique to our game. We have a 2 resource system to our game. Another thing that's a little bit more unique about our game is just the overall structure of how you're playing it. Typically, when you play a lot of card games, you have like your resource in play, and you have your creatures or your combatants that we call combatants in play. But that's pretty much it. You may not have a lot of other things going on. We have a little bit of a structure to how we play our game. So we have multiple rows. So we have, as I mentioned, influence. So we have an influence row. So you play your cards in a row. You don't have to, but they're in their own dedicated zone. You also have your sights, which typically it's a little bit more structured in the sense that you have a front row and then a rear row. And that allows players to strategically kind of develop how they want to play and how they want to protect themselves. So without going too deep into the mechanic side of things, front row protects your rear row. If you haven't played our game, your opponent has to attack those sights first before they can attack you. But then once they get through your sights, they can start attacking you if you have no sights in play. But that structure that's the point I'm trying to get at. We have a little bit more structure to our card game, which, again, if you're familiar with like tabletop war games or miniature games, not only is that deck construction kind of borrowing from that, but having a little bit of structure on the battlefield also kind of relates to that experience as well, which we've liked. And again, the feedback that we've gotten so far, that seems to be a cool thing. So we're excited that that's something that we're not alone with others liking that mechanic, or mechanism. Another unique element to our game is the round-based system. So typically, most card games have your turns, which we have our turns as well, but what's unique about our turn and round system specifically is that when you're playing the card game, you have your initiative player and your off initiative player. And for those of you not familiar with those terms, you have the guy that goes first and the guy that goes second. So typically, if you're the first player or the on initiative player, you have a little bit of advantage in most of the card games. If you get your opponent down to 0 health or whatever the winning condition is, you win the game. That's it. Game over. In our game, it's kind of like if baseball, if you will, where you have the top of the inning and a bottom of the inning. So in our game, you have the top of the round and the bottom of the round. If I'm the initiative player and I get my opponent's health down to 0 or even below 0, which you can do in our game, you can go below 0 health, you can go to negative. Once that occurs, the off initiative player still has their turn. So they have an opportunity essentially to swing back and still win the game. If they get your health, the initiative player's health, below 0 or further below 0 than what that initiative player got the opponent's health down to, then that off initiative player can win. That may sound a little complicated, but quite frankly, what it comes down to is the first player is not guaranteed to win if they get the opponent down to 0. The other player still has a chance to win. And that, at the end of the day, is what we really like about this game. As you're playing, there's always a chance, if you were the off initiative player, to come back and win. While maybe not entirely exclusively unique to us, but we designed the game not just mechanically, but we designed it with lore and fiction and a rich art setting in mind. So the setting of our world was at the forefront of our design of this game. So we didn't backward engineer a setting for our game or vice versa. They were kind of developed together. So we have our mechanisms and game design, and then we have our actual settings. So with our story and with our artwork. So that's another thing that kind of sets us apart, we think. So those are the things that kind of separate our game, that makes Battle for Sularia a little more unique, and why we get excited about it, just because that experience is always new for us too.
So what makes Battle for Sularia familiar? You just got done listening to what makes Battle for Sularia different, but one of the things we think is great is to kind of build off of the foundation of other great games that came before and create a natural evolution from that. And so what you heard from John is the uniqueness of the game and what makes it different, but some of the things you'll find are very familiar as well. And those things are, for example, 7 cards in a starting hand, for example. The having a life and then having your life eliminated is somewhat similar and familiar to players. Additionally, you'll find some standard abilities that kind of become staples in card games that exist inside of Sularia for that exact same reason, to create familiarity and to kind of ease the learning curve into the game, if you will. Additionally, Sularia is a game that plays at a similar kind of pace, so it is natural to want to kind of compare it to Magic the Gathering. It was inspired by Magic the Gathering and inspired by the Versus system and many other trading card games that John and I have experienced over the years. And we would be remiss to not pay homage to those in our own design, but at the same time we wanted to make sure it was different, and I think we've done a good job of establishing that. Activating a card in Battle for Sularia is very similar to other card games where you rotate a card 90 degrees to the right, and by doing so you indicate to your opponent that you're using the ability of that card, or you're attacking with that card, or you're defending with that card, or you're doing a variety of different things that just help instruct the opponent visually that something's going on. And so we feel like, obviously, why break a system or try to redesign a system that works so very well as such a fundamental mechanism inside of strategy card games? And I don't think we're alone in many people using that same particular thing. So again, there are lots of familiarities in that sense, where you're going to see things going on inside the game and go, oh, if you've played other games of this type, like Magic or like Versus, you're going to go, I definitely get that. But it also, I believe, because of the uniqueness of the things that John has talked about, really built upon it in such a way that it does provide an entirely different experience than any of those games before.
So if you haven't looked over the campaign yet, there's 3 different pledge tiers. Of those 3 tiers, there's your support tier, which we call the test subject, because we're all about being thematic with pretty much everything we do with our game. So we have our test subject, and that particular pledge tier is for those that just want to keep an eye on the campaign. It gives you the opportunity to get access to a free print and play version of the Proton. and it allows you to, again, see all of the updates. Keep an eye on the campaign overall. It's pretty simple. The other pledge tier is our the Proton, which is our fancy way of saying that's the basic pledge level. That gets you access to all the stretch goals. It gives you access to all the updates that we have. It gives you the game, basically. So pretty simple. Again, it's our basic pledge level, the Proton. And then the third pledge tier, that's the what we call the all-in new player. If you're new to Battle for Sularia, this gives you the opportunity to go all in, literally, and get everything for the game. So it'll give you the Battle Begins, which was our first starter set. It will also give you the Command Pack, which was the Command Pack Blood, Profit, and Glory was our first expansion. It's a nice support expansion, if you will, to the overall game system. It gives you access to a lot more mercenaries to customize your play experience, as well as some of the base level characters, the Jotun and the Scythian, which I'll talk a little bit more about those factions here in a moment. But it gives you those two items or games, and then it also gives you the Proton, which is what we're here for today. So it gives you everything, and of course you'll have access to all the updates and all the stretch goals that the Proton pledge tier would have as well. So those are our three core tiers: the test subject, the Proton, and then the new player all in. Of those three pledge tiers, which one's right for you? Well, again, it all depends on where you're at. If you're unfamiliar with our game but you're not quite ready to go all in, then that support pledge is probably what you should consider. The test subject support pledge is what you should consider. It'll at least let you get some insight and a feel for the game, as well as just see what the overall community is like. So yeah, it's just a way of getting a little bit more insight as to what the game is about, and then what the Proton specifically are about. And then if you've played for a while, like we have, even internally with our playtesters, like they've been excited to see this finally come out. The Proton offers a number of new mechanisms for the game. They have their own new keywords, their own play style. It's a totally brand new self-contained faction. So, you've had a chance to play with the Scythian for a while, or the Jotun for a while. Now you have access to the Proton. So they're standalone faction, just like the other two core factions. And they can also play with the mercenaries. Now, again, if maybe you were a test subject for a while, or maybe you want more than just the Proton faction. Maybe you have a friend, or again, you're a new player and you're just super excited and you want to get everything. You want to a completist, which that's myself included. I like to get everything. So that's for you. The all-in gives you access to the starter set, which is the Battle Begins. It gives you access to our first expansion, which is Blood, Profit, and Glory. And then it'll give you access to the Proton as well. So it'll give you everything. And again, as Jesse has pointed out, when we produce our games, you get a full play set of everything. So you don't have to buy multiples just to have because you didn't get enough to begin with. It's just if you want. Because again, everything that we have comes with the full play set, which is 4 copies of every card. So again, that's the all-in. If you're been waiting to pull the trigger for a while on Battle for Sularia, now is an ideal time because you get everything. So as I mentioned before, there's the Jotun, there's the Scythian, and we have mercenaries, which are a support faction, and then now the Proton. So what are all these different factions, and I'll talk a little bit about their play style and how they fit into the setting or the lore of our game. So I'll talk first about the Proton, since they're our brand new faction. The Proton are native to Sularia, but they've not been they've kind of been lost, if you will, to the knowledge or history of the world. So those very unfamiliar with Battle for Sularia, there was an event called the Fracture. It's a post-apocalyptic event, and now Battle for Sularia takes place considerably into the future, about 800 plus years, right? So the Proton were a biological weapon, if you will, that were being developed prior to the fracture occurring. and they had their own kind of ecosystem environment set up to basically test out these creatures and to see how they would work in a combat environment, right? But ultimately, when the fracture occurred, those testing facilities became locked down and happened to just be buried underneath the rubble, essentially, and forgotten about. People were just trying to survive. The people that knew about the Protoan likely don't exist anymore. That may be explored more in lore in the future. Very few people knew about the existence of the Protoan to begin with. So now fast forwards so many years into the future, after a post-apocalyptic event, after an apocalyptic event, we're now in that post time period. People just don't know about them. And that kind of sets the setting, if you will, for the Protoan. They've recently been discovered. If you have read our fiction, we kind of allude to their existence, but we don't go into the specifics of who discovered them or how they've resurfaced. I can only talk a little bit about that right now, but if you followed our campaign or the promotion of the Protoan, you know that we have another faction in development that we developed in coordination under the whole Reign of Terror umbrella, and that's the X-Solarian. So we have the Protoan and we have the X-Solarian. I won't talk too much about the X-Solarian other than they were the faction that ultimately let them out. Not intentionally. The X-Solarian are scavengers, and they accidentally, as they were scavenging for resources and old technology, they inadvertently released them back onto the surface of the planet. So I'll talk more about the X-Solarian in a future video, but that's how that interaction occurred. So now that we have the Protoan on the surface on Sularia, they've been adapting and changing, etc., and spreading. That's what they were designed to do, was to basically kind of eradicate or alter their environment to fit their needs, and that's what they've been doing, is evolving and spreading kind of uncontrollably. Originally, it was up to the controllers of them originally that made them to keep them in check. Well, those check systems don't exist anymore. So they're now spreading like a plague or a virus on the planet, if you will. In fact, that's one of their mechanisms, is virus, which also there's the virus and then infection. And I can talk about that too, or maybe Jesse will talk about that mechanic at a later date. But they're spreading, and now they're interacting with the other factions on the planet. So that leads me to the other faction. So if you got The Battle Begins, you should be by now hopefully familiar with the Jotun and the Scythian, and likely the Mercenary as well. They were a part of The Battle Begins, but they were heavily featured in the Blood, Profit, and Glory command pack. But a little bit about those factions. The Jotun were the primary surviving faction originally of the Fracture, and they had built these different biodomes. They survived, but they also started limiting their membership, if you will. If you didn't meet their the specific criteria of their civilization, you were kicked out. That actually set the framework for the X-Solarians. They were exiled out. The Jotun, actually, they were initially a mining corporation. They had these machines, automatons, if you will, bots, etc., whatever term you want to use. But they had these different construction systems in place that allowed them to have a pretty prosperous society. So when the fracture occurred, they were more or less ready for it. But fast forward, like I said, so many years into the future, they started to get a little bit more desperate with their resources, and they advanced their technology to the point where they created an artificial intelligence for their robots that they used. Eventually, as you know, hopefully by now, those became the Scythian. And the Scythian for a while did act as a labor force for the Jotun, but ultimately they became self-aware to the point where they did not agree with everything the Jotun were doing. Again, we have a long 30-some plus chapters of lore that kind of talks about that separation of the Scythian from the Jotun. So I encourage you to read those. Those are on our website, in fact. But for the explanation of this, we now have the Scythian split off from the Jotun, often out in the wastes, developing their own society. The battle begins kind of addresses that friction point of the Jotun need resources. They also don't need the competition, realistically, that the Scythian are putting on them as well. So they're kind of killing two birds with one stone. You have the Jotun militarize themselves to go after the Scythian, so in turn the Scythian have to start militarizing themselves to not only defend themselves, but maybe, just push back. They're tired of the Jotun, trying to take what they feel is equally theirs as well. Add in this third factor now, the Protoan. The Protoan doesn't care. The Protoan just wants to take over everything. That's what they were designed for. So they're spreading. If a Scythian gets in their way, either absorb it or eradicate it. Same with the Jotun. If they get in their way, absorb it or eradicate it, to become this one Protoan ecosystem on the planet. That leaves the mercenaries, of course. Well, the Jotun obviously need help, so they're going to hire the mercenaries. The Scythian will likely need help. They'll hire or figure out an arrangement of sorts with maybe their advanced technology with the mercenaries. And then, of course, the mercenaries themselves, they're going to get absorbed or captured or taken over, whether it's through biochemical or mental manipulation. The Protoan are essentially a hive mind. They have a certain psychic ability, if you will. Combine that with the biological infection, they can kind of take over their hosts and kind of control them and do what they want. That type of trope is not unusual, right, for a lot of alien type factions. This is kind of in that line of an alien-esque type faction. So they can control the mercenaries in that respect. There might be a few mercenaries that can somehow be immune to that conditioning, if you will, and they work with the Protoans for other reasons. That's to be explored into the future with our lore, so I can't go too far into that. But that's the general understanding of how the Protoan work, how the Scythian and the Jotun work, and how the mercenaries kind of float between all those different factions.
The Protoan bring a brand new and exciting way to play Sularia, Battle for Sularia, to the table. It's the first time that we've really had the opportunity to play with a general design mechanism principle called go wide in strategy card games. So when you look at the Jotun and the Scythian in particular, they both have strategies that kind of evolve from the go tall. So they don't necessarily have a lot of combatants or creatures or units, whatever you'd like to call them yourself. We call them combatants out on the battlefield, but instead the ones that are out there do very powerful things individually that kind of go big on one guy's strategy. The Protoan, on the other hand, are not functioning that way at all. Instead, they function on this mentality of, I'm going to make a lot of little things that are just going to overwhelm the board. A very Zerg-like mentality, if you're familiar with that term from StarCraft and other types of strategy card games, real-time strategy video games. So with that Zerg mentality in mind, almost everything that came from them from a design standpoint permeated from that base foundation of making little guys. And through that, they do things like eat their small young ones in order to make their big ones bigger. So that kind of replays back into that go tall strategy, but doing it through the use of their little guys. They also are using a mechanism we call virus, and virus is an exciting thing where when a Protoan combatant with virus dies on the battlefield for whatever reason, regardless, maybe it's you surrendered that thing to one of your guys as part of a rite of domination ritual that goes on in the Protoan, or you surrendered them to a metamorphosis chamber or some other function that's going on to eliminate it for benefit to your bigger guy. The virus counters then spread to your opponent's combatants, and that infection reduces the efficiency of your opponent's combatants up to a point to where they could even die. So Protoan get value from things dying on the battlefield as part of their mechanisms. Now they're also doing a couple of other things very, very well, and one of those things is the growth of their horde, if you will, and then combine that with the fact that the larger the horde gets, the more attractive the big mythical creatures of the Protoan faction find that horde, whether it's to eat them because they're hungry, or whether it's just because they want to they become attracted to the size of this particular horde and want to lead it. And so through that, you'll find that the bigger, kind of stronger, beefier creatures of the Protoan world are not too far behind when those little guys start becoming more and more prevalent on the battlefield. And so it becomes a very important strategy for your opponent to figure out how to manage the token production, the 1/1 creature production that comes from the faction overall. And then kind of to take that a step further, the Protoan, they want to continue to kind of leverage their power. And so because of their nature and their ferocity and their kind of horrific kind of visual to them, they can intimidate their opponents. And we do that through a mechanism called challenge. And what challenge does is it forces, essentially kind of freezes their opponent's combatants in place and forces them to fight this thing. And so it's a great way for the Protoan to kind of control what their opponents are doing, but through the use of combatants that are going to be attacking. Now that does create some very interesting balance in the game, and it does put opponents in a position where those challenge-based Protoan combatants have to be dealt with. They can't be left out there to just systematically whittle down your forces that you've spent most of the game building up. And so it really does create a nice back and forth between the factions. And if that Protoan snowball does get going, it's almost a surefire guaranteed victory for them. Well, we need Kickstarter for a variety of reasons. But the biggest reason, of course, is the fact that we're just a small company. We're trying to grow and establish ourselves into this business. And quite honestly, Kickstarter gives us the best opportunity to bring exciting and new ideas to you, the backer. But we can't do that without funds, of course. And, we've done everything we can to make as much of an investment into this property over the years as possible. And we definitely just need your assistance as we continue to move forward in developing this game further. With your help on Kickstarter, your pledge will help us complete the remaining artwork for the Protoan faction, as well as take care of any production costs that are associated with the development of this game. And so in the start of this Kickstarter, the game is set up as a print on demand, which means that we'll be able to essentially complete it a little quicker and deliver it faster than our anticipated timelines. However, with multiple people helping support and build this campaign, we really hope that it'll stretch into a real retail box product, and maybe even go further into adding the final faction, the Solarians, to the mix. So we definitely know that your pledge is important to us. We want to do everything possible to earn your pledge, and we really hope that together we can build this thing into something that's much greater and bigger than it exists today, right now. So the Reign of Terror Protoan faction Kickstarter is doing something a little different with stretch goals than we've done in the past. We really like some of the trends that are existing on Kickstarter today, and one of those is this idea that stretch goals are like missions or objectives for you as a backer and for us as a company to work towards achieving, kind of like playing a video game. And with that in mind, being that John and I are both avid video game players at heart as well, we really like this idea of creating this fundamental community-based goal system that just isn't solely driven by a linear rate of financial growth that you find in traditional stretch goals. And so with that in mind, we're going to start our first stretch goal objective, and we're going to reveal that to you right away here today as part of the campaign. And that goal is to turn the faction pack, or the Protoan faction, into a retail product. And what we'll get out of that particular goal is an opportunity to reprint our learn to play rules that we've currently in the process of redesigning and developing to make the game easier for you and your friends to get into, and then also in turn it's going to help us improve in terms of getting a box for the product and some various other components into that as well that will really help and start helping enhance the gameplay experience, and making it easier for you as backers as well as for your friends to get into the game, because quite frankly we'll be able to have an easier opportunity to sell this product to your friendly local game store. And then from there, the other major objectives that'll start to come out from that are going to be things like the Sularia faction and adding them in, so that we can really expand this game to the core 4 factions that we really envisioned for this game way back when in 2011 when we started this process and this project. And going forward, when we did The Battle Begins and released the Jotun and the Scythian, we want to bring that last faction into the fold as quickly as possible. And so you as backers can help us do that by sharing this campaign, by doing all those things and working together as a community to build up the awareness of Sularia as a product. And then finally, we'll have some really cool additional major objective missions, or actually objectives that are related to enhancing the game even further. At some point, we'll run out of major objectives. So, to be fair, these are things that we envision for this particular campaign. But during the whole process of that, there'll be missions, and these missions are going to really change the shape of the campaign, and they're much more easily achievable. They're made through smaller financial gains. They offer uniqueness to the campaign. They're going to give us the ability to really play with you and talk about like how to make this campaign exactly what you want it to be as well. So expect to see some polls coming out, things like that will help shape future objectives on this campaign as we start to progress past the funding point. So as you can see, we're very confident and hopeful that through your help and your assistance, we're going to get to the funding goal, and then we're going to have a lot of fun with these missions and objectives, pushing the campaign even further.